Our last speaker for this session is Jack Milbank. Jack is the Managing Director of Hortus Technical Services. Jack is a man of many talents. He's an agronomist, he owns quality labs, and most importantly he also owns a social enterprise brewery, and I understand that his beer brand is going gangbusters. So I welcome Jack to the floor.
Hi guys. Firstly, thanks for having me along. I know I'm mindful of being the last speaker in the session, so if everyone's wide awake, I'm going to be talking about beer. It's exciting, and I was sort of trying to think what connection I'd have with all the grain growers in the room, and I'm starting, hopefully going to be buying a lot more of your grain and doing a bit more value adding. And I suppose what I want to focus on in my discussion is we use software as a tool to help us do things, and I suppose I'm an agronomist, but I'm more becoming an entrepreneur, and I like to think of all the different tools that we can use, that growers can use to supply markets, and software is a critical tool that fits into that. And so what I'm going to touch on in my presentation is how we integrate all these different tools to help us achieve the sort of objectives that we're each trying to go for. So just my background, I'm a complete mixture of everything. I grew up on a cattle and game ranch in Zimbabwe, studied agronomy, which on starting worked out, that's what my grandfather did for the Imperial Chemical Company in India and Malta, and then Jamaica, where my mother was born. You know, so we've been all over the place, but anyway, I ended up in Australia, and was farming, got a Nuffield scholarship in about 2006, and it's led me down this path. You'll see the strange array of businesses I now run. But my study topic when I was doing my Nuffield, at the time we were growing passion fruit, so I was passionate about high-value horticultural products. So my study topic was globally competitive horticultural production, processing and marketing using renewable energy with a net benefit on the regional supply chain. So a pretty long-winded bloody topic. But you'll see how that all comes to bear. So Hortus is just an overarching agronomy company. So we have a NITRA-accredited microbiology lab, a NITRA-accredited chemistry lab, our own in-house software developers, our own team of agronomists, and we just manage horticulture. That's our game. We have quite enough complexity with 300 crops to deal with. We've got 35 just in our region, all irrigated, and it's very different to the broadacre game, but hopefully we'll touch on a few of those sorts of things. So as I mentioned, we're going to touch on the interface of where software and all these different tools can fit in to help us achieve what we're trying to do. Is just everyone's trying to make a living. We're trying to sell grain or go to work and write software that people can use and hopefully buy, or we're doing soil tests to work out what what contract spreaders can go and spread. So I'm just going to try and work out a few things that we've learnt along the way. We don't sell any software. We're purely a service company. So we're agronomists. Growers pay us on a per-hour basis to help them grow their crops, and then we test for them. We do their soil test results. We tell them how much NPK they should put on, what chemicals they should spray, and I suppose we're trying to drag as many different components that are useful tools that we can use that help them achieve the end goal of just making a good living and having no rejections from the supermarkets, or we do a lot of melons, zucchinis that they meet specifications when they're exported to New Zealand or Hong Kong, and we don't get rejections, and everyone can be happy. So a lot of the tools we look at as an integrated company is just how can we mitigate risk, how can we increase performance. So this is Auschili, which is a fantastic local business up in Bundaberg that's exporting all over the place, but it's chilies. There's not many chili growers in Australia, so it's very specific to the varieties. And then so we're working towards releasing a very basic drone service where we'll do regular flights every 2 weeks and then take SAP tests, not dry tissues. We look at the nutrients in solution, and then so using that zonal tissue sampling with live drone data that feeds that NDVI up to the grower's cloud account so they can access it live together with their microbial data, so all their food safety, so the E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella for their compliance, their chemical residue data so that they can provide that data to the supermarkets to demonstrate their food safety. Then we do what are called pre-shipment inspections. So for the insurance companies, that if a grower is exporting, the insurance companies will then insure that consignment against inherent vice. So it's not going to break down en route. So there's not a claim from the buyer in the other country that goes, your zucchini's arrived and they're terrible. He goes, well, no, they're not. We did a pre-shipment inspection. Everything's here. We did all this, and they're fine. So we started that with avocados, and it worked fantastically well. I'll come back to it towards the end. I suppose from a disruption point of view, 15 years ago when I first started as an agronomist it was CropTech back then, which CropTech was then sold to T-Systems and then John Deere, and then I bought it off John Deere about 2009. But I used to go and, collect soil samples, test, irrigation, and we had neutron probes. I think I remember taking readings out at Cubby Station for work experience in the late 90s. We've got a fantastic little probe now that just sends messages, and this is monitoring EC at every depth, soil temperature at every depth, soil moisture at every depth, and then we can determine a list of operators that get either a text or an email. If, for example, the EC at 40 centimeters goes above 0.2, which is then being calibrated to our soil solution test in the lab, so we know we're now leaching a specific fertilizer below 40 centimeters, it'll then alert the owner that he can give his irrigation manager a kick up the backside and say, you've left the water on too long. It's still a manual process, but as we'll see, that's the essential part of actually not just relying on data. You've got to be in the field managing what's the processes that are happening, and whether it's the agronomist or consultant working with the grower or one of the grower's employees, that data access and physical alerts, whether it's a text that pops up as opposed to an email that they may not have the settings right on their phone, that they automatically get their emails fed through. So that's just very basic sum graph, stack graph, and the EC. But I suppose the ability to, and we've now got some of these installed in Thailand in sugarcane, so we're no longer constrained as a service provider to just work here. We're physically managing how sugarcane crops are irrigated in another country with global roaming, data being sent over. They then own sugarcane farms in Australia as well. So it's fast becoming, using a bit of this technology here and deploying it in other parts of the world. Again, you've seen millions of these maps, so I won't bore you with any more. But I suppose what we're looking at is, with the fortnightly service of drone operating, is to look at the rate of change of the NDVI and then linking that back to SAP levels. So this is something that no one else has done in my knowledge, but there's been, I suppose, 30-odd years of us doing SAP testing, and with high-value, fast-moving horticultural crops, the optimal level of nutrient in a plant tissue changes very rapidly. If you're dealing with a highly perishable crop like strawberries or blueberries or rock melons, the nutrient concentrations on a weekly interval change. And so the goalposts are constantly moving for us. And understanding previously, or what we do at the moment, to be honest, we take a SAP test across that whole block, and it'll be a randomized sample collection across that block. We're ignoring the intricacies of where we could actually then take green samples and red samples on a regular basis every 2 weeks, and then eventually creating the nutrient layers where we correlate the NDVI number with our optimal range part per million with the lab result. So we can now start to do very accurate in-crop over, because our crops only go for 8 to 12 to 16 weeks, so they're very, very short crops. How that then relates back to, I suppose, using these algorithms to calculate, ideal in irrigated ag, so it's all fertigation, everything gets pumped through as tech-grade solubles in the row. So we monitor soluble nutrients or the soluble cation ratios as opposed to exchangeables, and using some of the spatial data or NDVI data may enable us to pick up in combination with an EC probe, somewhere where the EC is very low, it may have been saturated, so have high water holding capacity, so it might generate slightly more vigorous crops. And with those more vigorous crops, you'll then have a green zone, so you think it's all healthy, but actually in horticulture, in tomatoes, for example, if it's too vigorous, you'll get a Heliothis egg lay on the tips of those, that nice flush green growth. And so the economic impact of that is far greater than a slightly dry, stressed tomato block where you actually might get increased flowering, slightly smaller fruit, which is still suitable for the supermarket. You probably make a lot more money off what's perceived as the red stress zone. So training your agronomists to interpret and use that data in the field properly so that it's giving an economic outcome for the grower to make more money, because at the end of the day, that's the whole game. All of the software tools, at the end of the day, if we're not generating more revenue per ton of product, whether it's GDP, that's what it all has to come back to. The difficulties is obviously with depth. That's why we then have to take a lot, if we're relying on a cost-effective drone service to cover the ground, we're then needing to look at the change in nutrient concentration at depth. So it can change drastically, particularly with some poor cultural practices of cultivation. You'll get hard pan layers where people are just going over the top with a rotary hoe, and so you get very different story down the soil profile. So always ground truthing, going back to the data and then inspecting the field and not just taking one angle of the information. But so we build as this is in the real sense, we're building layers. It's not all spatially referenced layers, because it has to be, this is the interface of reality and software to provide tools. And we've tried really hard to just continually combine all of those services into a nice, easily understood format that growers can follow with all the complicated information behind. So that, we have a nice traffic light system for all of our saps and quick soils. Obviously, the nutrient interactions, this is where the disruption with software being able to calculate your elemental requirements based on algorithms that we write, looking at the NDVI data, then looking at the nutrient requirement of that crop based on its yield demand, then looking at the soil solution with a continuous monitoring of its EC, we can then start to work out, right, if, let's use proven old science with new technology, combine the two so that we can then draw better conclusions to calculate, more accurate algorithms to say we need to spot deploy a little bit of boron just to this section, and then we can use something like a very low carrying drone to deploy 40 litres just to very specific sections of the crop. But you can't do that just on its own. You've got to be able to layer all of these bits of technology together. So you take your first layer as an image, then you take your sap and soils, then you might do a pest and disease inspection, which is GPS referenced and overlaid on top of it. You use some of the algorithms from historical soil data to say, right, well, if this is that level in the soil test, but it's showing this level in the sap test, there's been an inhibition of uptake as a result of the interaction of boron and calcium, and so we now need to address this in-crop nutrient management by deployment of a targeted chelated boron spray for this little section. All of this has applicability for grain. It's just on we're able to put a fair bit of detail into it because we're dealing on a smaller scale, but high value. I'll just touch on this very quickly. So the timing of application, at the end of the day, timing is just as critical as the amount. So a lot of the technology that's related to precision ag or software is comes back to exactly how much to put on or where to put it. There's less emphasis is being placed on the timing, and that's because due to environmental factors that goalpost is always moving as well. So it comes back to the phenological interval of timing of applications. This is going to sort of lead on to my next point, where somewhere where we've missed out is the one area that has the biggest impact on agricultural output is climatic variability. So the climate is the one thing that really makes or breaks, I'm sure in grain, and I'm sure in cotton, and definitely in horticulture. So I've been working on a really interesting project with a Canadian company called Cravo with retractable roof greenhouses. So we've got the first sort of large-scale outdoor one installed, and the first crop of tomatoes to be picked next week. So it's a 10-acre retractable roof field cover. And basically that's overcoming the timing, the critical timing nature, because we're managing the climate as well as all the other parameters now. We have sensors on the roofs. We've got probes installed. We take fortnightly sapping or weekly sapping quick soils. We're tweaking things all the time, but we're going now for double the yield which we would have got off that same paddock last year just by managing the climate. So it sort of then pales in comparison the additional technology, when the biggest influence is something that we, if we just address that, and we've doubled our yield in 1 year from, it doesn't have to be a huge area. So, we've gone from 80 tons to 160 tons, and, over 10 acres, it's still $6-7 million. So it's a huge economic impact by just targeting what bits of technology. And so for me, that disruption is a critical, critical one. And manipulating that climate enables us to better manipulate the nutrient uptake and understand what's happening with nutrient demands and deliver those more effectively. It's just a very nice quick slide about optimal demand pathways with the the moving goalposts all the time, and then similarly with the the hormone influences, so less relevant to this audience, I suppose. Again, this is just touching on my using the SAP test with drones and NDVIs. What we're hoping to identify with this is the targeted application of, this is coming back to what's the useful outcome of generating NDVI data using drones. For us, one of the big expenses is insecticides, and so hopefully we can identify through high nitrates in our SAP tests that we pick up that targeted sampling zone from the NDVI imagery, that we can then, instead of disrupting that whole paddock through the use of a miticide, we'll then pick up the stress points of where we might have a mite flare or two-spotted mite flare, which is a big pest in a lot of horticultural crops, and we can spray, a miticide in one area and then just target release of a predatory mite in another area, and so the dual use of some of the aerial technology where you collect data, analyze it, interpret it, work out what's the best mode of action by getting an agronomist to go and check it. We work through it, discuss it, and then what's the most effective method of deploying a solution for it. And it's not always jumping in a tractor and spraying, which is what has been the sort of norm for a lot of horticulture growers. 3 years ago, we were spraying 3 times a week, so every couple of days. Identifying areas in which we can make savings by targeting how we can reduce, chemical load and the quality, so that we don't get a rejection for chemical residue in an export market. This is where looking at it from a multitude of angles is really critical. And looking at trends over time. I've touched on this. This is displaying very simple elemental requirements. So similarly with some of the API discussions regarding software, we've written some really neat algorithms to help calculate a standardized method of elemental requirements, so that we can send out an NPK elemental requirement very simply based on having a soil testing lab, We do a lot of tests, and then having agronomists in the field, we're analysing the response to different agronomic practices that we've put in place. So to try and then calculate, we do a lot of fruit testing to work out the nutrient removal of crops from a paddock, and so that we can then say, well, what's the nutrient removal per unit, per tonne, and then we use that to help us calculate our it's different in horticulture, and I've got to do that for about 300 crops. So we've got a lot of different, calculating the nutrient removal of beetroot is, you've got to physically go and test the beetroot, work out how much nutrient, the beetroot's taking off, and then what typical yield goals are, and then huge fluctuations in yield goal mean that we've got to be constantly analysing what's happening. Obviously, we have our own little app that's, we georeference every pest point. So I think last year we did about 50,000 individual identified pests and diseases, as a confirmed identification. So this is really useful for, we do pre-shipment inspections on zucchinis that go to New Zealand, and rock melons. So pretty much all the rock melons and zucchinis that leave Australia, we either do the tissue testing, the pest and disease monitoring for, and then the pre-shipment inspection for prior to it being loaded on a ship and sent overseas. So AQUIS, we have registered AQUIS officers. This becomes really useful for AQUIS when we can give them a downloaded spreadsheet of every GPS reference point of every pest found on that block. If there's a risk of something being found just prior to it being loaded in a container, we can go back and say, nope, this is what was found, this is when it was found, this is the exact location it was found. AQUIS can send an officer out there, no, it's not a big issue, yep, you can pass it. So again, we're just trying to think practically, how can we limit things that inhibit a return on investment to get money back in. And so we're just in the process now of color coding everything. When there's, that's only just over one area that I've just zoomed in, so that's a lot of history. We've got to date it, but every single pest point, we're now going to have all the layers underneath. So it's a huge database to reference. But basically, what we then do, presenting the data in a nice format back for the growers. So we now do this for every block. All of our recommendations, we produce for us, the key driver for performance is the grower. We operate on the agronomic service end. So what the grower gets for his product is his business. It'd be lovely for us to manage it, but we don't. And so at the end of the day, he wants to understand exactly what his cost per hectare is, so he can benchmark. So if we're looking at a big snow pea, mixed farming operation where there's probably 300 different management units of high-value snow peas, tomato, all different crops. He just wants to compare the benchmark or how good a job we've done at keeping his costs down. So not over-recommending chemicals or putting too much of one sort of ferton or relying, correcting our agronomic mistakes using liquid fertilizers instead of the right rate of gypsum at the start, which is a lot cheaper. So for us, breaking down this, the cumulative cost of production is critical. This is from a few years ago, so you can just see how many sprays have gone on there, and it's ridiculous. And but this is what was happening, and you could tell the growers that no, please, not again, not. And at the end of the day, this is where there's advice. You can give the advice whether it's taken or not, and you can record it, and you can provide the tools to help people make better decisions. At the end of the day, there has to be a will to do it, and that's market forces that will then determine that. If the market rejects it for a certain reason, that'll then create the demand for people to change their practices. And this is, for my mind, a big reason why controlling the climate through a thing like a retractable roof greenhouse that's courted our insecticide use, because having side walls, we're intercepting the flight path of a number of the pests. The crops are so much healthier. We don't have the disease issues affecting it. We're eliminating any leaf wetness time, so the necessity for fungicides and bactericides is vastly reduced. but we're doubling our yield at the same time as halving our crop protection inputs. We put a lot more fertilizer in, but that's because we're getting a lot bigger yield, so we've got to feed that nutrient removal. Again, that's a sample of this, the EC monitoring, looking at fertilizer placement. So we're, as good environmental stewards, and a lot of our clients are on the Great Barrier Reef, and so we're governed, I suppose, to a degree by the 6 easy steps, and our lab has to test, and we're not allowed to recommend more than a certain number of units of N&P. And I suppose coming back to the overarching thing for me from a value-added perspective, which environmental responsibility is critical. Now that I operate across a couple of sectors, I need tourists and backpackers to drink beer. And if there's no reef, they're not going to do it. And if there's no growers, we're not going to have the grain or the hops to produce the beer that the tourists are going to drink when they're visiting the reef. I just sort of have approached this. I've got to find, this is going off topic a bit, but it's just really, this is where it all comes in together a bit. I've got a fantastic, a fantastic partner in Good Beer Co. So we're looking at these reef funding projects that we can use for, 50% of the profits of the beers going towards the Australian Marine Conservation, so that they can then improve reef quality. Education programs for cane growers on the reef so that they have better nutrient use. And so this is one of the tools we're hoping we can put out there. Another quick example, this is a new startup on-site nutrient monitoring. That's a very quick example of what our pre-shipment inspections look like. We've got to cut open every avo, melon, that sort of thing. That's just obviously the ag eagle, that's a drone, the agronomist that has to inspect the crop, and then that's deploying predatory mites. So, and to finish up, I suppose, as a take-home message, emphasizing the holistic approach, monitoring your target response to reduce your waste, so it creates a cycle of continuous improvement, and share the load, don't go it alone. You've got to build your team around you of good advisors, good service providers, good customers. Never rely just on your opinion. A few sharp eyes are better than just one. There's always room for improvement, no matter how well you think you're doing it. There's always room for improvement. So thanks very much.